wind scale. Everything changed when that bloody atom plant went up in flames.
Citizens of Wyndham, there has been an increase in bandit activity outside the village walls.
So, Atomfall. It's coming very soon. Where did the idea come from?
The very genesis of Atomfall was an idea by Jason Kingsley, one of the founders and owners of Rebellion. He observed that there's a lot of games set in kind of quarantine zones, like nuclear disaster quarantine zones, but there wasn't one based around the world's first major nuclear disaster, which was the Windscale fire. So that was the sort of start point. From that trigger point, we thought, what happens if you take that setting, that theme, and find a way to make a kind of Rebellion-style RPG-ish adventure in that kind of setting. And all of the details of the game kind of came organically and naturally from building the setting, building it around that 1960s atmosphere, and the kind of DNA of what makes a Rebellion game a Rebellion game.
Right. That kind of Wicker Man influence in there, that folklore, did you have to do a lot of research into that kind of thing and make sure it applies to that part of the country?
So we did lots of research, not so much to make sure it applies to that specific part of the country, but we did do research into that part of the country. So there's two different answers I can give you there. One is very early in the process, team members went up to the Lake District and just spent time in the local villages and took reference photos. And what was very helpful is that some of the team members aren't from the UK, and they can highlight elements that we as UK natives don't even notice are there, if that makes sense. Like dry stone walls is the big obvious example that our art lead is American, and he thought these walls were really interesting because, I mean, they're older than America, but they're the edges of fields to us. So one part of the process was making sure that we, culturally are already aware of the location and are head writers sort of from roughly the area. So we tackled it from that angle. And then at the same time, a lot of the storytelling tradition of the UK became an influence. So like you say, the Wicker Man, that kind of folk horror atmosphere. Given that the story's set in 1960s, we looked at all of the kind of fiction of the era. So there's bits of John Wyndham in there. There's the village in the game's called Wyndham, for example. There's influences of that cozy catastrophe genre. Also bits of folk horror, because it is just part of the cultural makeup of the UK, if that makes sense. We didn't have to impose it so much as embrace it. The other thing that we looked at was Cold War fiction, because that was a cultural influence at the time as well. And we found that if you overlay folk horror themes and Cold War themes, there's kind of resonances that happen. Both storytelling styles tackle the conflict between urban and rural civilization, between tradition and modernity, different cultural groups clashing with each other and both having legitimate claims to do so, all those sorts of murky themes. And that kind of moral grey tone is quite a British storytelling style as well. So what we found is, as we kind of embraced the setting, all of these resonances just emerged by themselves over time.
Also, another thing which you probably expected was that a kind of shorthand for this game has been like British Fallout. Was that something you expected?
I mean, that's a reasonable thing for people to construe from what they've seen of the game. And you could argue that there are definite influences from probably Fallout New Vegas, I would say, in that that game has densely connected quests and is built around one kind of layers of one narrative theme, if that makes sense. Our game is similar in that it's all about one story. What we've done is, instead of having quests, we have leads, which mean that you uncover the narrative yourself and you're never told what to do. You piece it together more like a detective. And all of the plot threads in the game and all of the local narratives in the game eventually lead back to that grander story. So it's kind of like a dense, concentrated version of one of the larger quests you might see in something like Fallout New Vegas. But at the same time, there's also reference and influence from the other kind of post-nuclear games, I guess, like Metro as an example as well, Stalker. There's a general tone to those sorts of games, and it's almost like a genre in itself. So we made sure we looked at all of those and pulled bits and pieces of all of them.
Yeah, I mean, Fallout's sort of unique in that it handles its subject matter with a little bit of levity and humour. Have you kind of gone down that route, or is it more kind of serious in tone?
It depends. So what Fallout does is uses that kind of futuristic optimism. There's a very American way of looking at things, you know, and the juxtaposition of the reality against that optimism gives you a tone clash, which is funny, and then you build on top of that to exaggerate things over time. What we wanted to do is do something similar, but with British pieces,
I
essentially.
suppose you've got the stiff upper lip and the keep calm and carry on sort of thing, haven't you?
Yeah, so all the characters take it very seriously, and the narrative of it all fits together. But the characters are eccentric. There are kind of British tropes, I guess, or explorations triggered by British tropes. A good tonal point of reference would be something like The Prisoner, in that it does have a bit of tone range to it. It has levity to it, but it's all within the context of that larger narrative.
Right. So when you visit a kind of like a village, are you kind of expecting the player to be discovering this sort of weird Port Merion type place? Will it be that kind of vibe?
It's got a bit of that vibe to it, yeah. So the village in the game Wyndham is modelled to be a kind of archetypal, like Cumbric village, but it does have that edge of weirdness to it, that something's going on that people aren't quite talking about. You come in as an outsider, so people don't entirely trust you, and there's something going on underneath the surface that you uncover as you explore. The characters there are kind of eccentrics that have found a way of coping in the environment that they find themselves. And then at the same time, there's a cultural reference or a cultural influence that I didn't expect. It kind of presented itself, and that was the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Because this game is set in a quarantine zone, one of the ways that people have tried to cope is there's a kind of military occupation trying to keep the peace. And depending on the player's interpretation, they might think that that peace has been kept a little too strictly, right? So it's all moral greys. There's no good guys and bad guys. So there's a military occupation in the village, keeping it civilized, but in a way that is restricting people's civil liberties. So there's like a tone mix there, if that makes sense.
Does that mean you're kind of caught in the middle of a few factions then?
Yes.
Can you align yourself with any of those factions?
Yes, to an extent, yeah. So you can sort of. Short answer is yes. There's several factions in the game that have come to a kind of uneasy balance, and you come in as an outsider and kind of like poke your face in places that it's not welcome.
And upset the balance potentially.
You upset the balance, but you can upset it in the favour of a faction that you sympathise with, or a character that you sympathise with. So a lot of the characters that you interact with all have a perspective on these events. And some may offer to help you escape this quarantine zone, but as a trade for helping them out. And you can choose to do so or not. You can kill any character in the game as well, and the game copes with that fine. And that seemed to lean into that sense of complete openness and freedom that really emerged by itself over the course of development. We tried a few different things and took a step back to give the player as much freedom as possible to explore where they want.
Right, so is this kind of an RPG first and foremost, would you say, at its heart?
Yes, somewhere between a survival action game and an RPG. So tonally, the economy is not dissimilar to something like Resident Evil Village or something like that. You've got an inventory, but it's quite limited. You're scavenging for resources, you're trying desperately to survive. It's structured similarly to an RPG, but with a kind of an action lean, a sort of action survival lean. And the total play time is like, it can vary depending on how you play, but it could be like 20 hours, plus or minus 10 depending on how you play, with very, very different routes through the game. So it's like an RPG, but a densely concentrated one. If you look at something like Sniper Elite, we make sandbox environments that have like a dense concentration of gameplay situations. We took that same philosophy and applied it to Atomfall. So it is an RPG, but a rebellion RPG.
Right. So in terms of like RPG mechanics then, I suppose you've got things like crafting, you've got stuff like skill trees and perks, stuff you can use to kind of define your character?
Yes, yes. So there's crafting and there's skills that you can find training manuals to allow you to then unlock them. But we wanted to make sure that they helped frame your journey a little bit, but didn't push it into something too fantastical. We wanted it to be a little bit grounded, so you always feel a bit desperate. Right. So they can give you an edge, but they don't pull you too away from that desperation. Yeah. So there is some of that to help you on your journey through the game.
So in terms of gameplay, did you bring much across from Sniper, or was this kind of a clean slate for you guys?
Well, we realised that there's a kind of a feel precedent set by Sniper, so we made sure that our gunplay feels good for sure. But beyond that, we wanted to start with a clean slate as much as possible, so that we could discover the mechanics and find out what's matched the setting the best. So there's more of a lean towards melee combat in this game, and scarcity in ammo, so that you mix up strategies. Avoid combat entirely sometimes. Enemy placement is more randomized in Sniper Elite. Randomized is close enough, yeah. Actually, there's an interesting sort of anecdote there, in that earlier in development, the team was populating environments in a style that was very similar to Sniper Elite. So you'd see a situation, you could observe it, and you could see what patrol routes were to give you an edge to then choose which guy to take out, kind of thing. And it was quite stable, and that encourages the player to play in that very Sniper Elite-ish style. But we wanted it to be more desperate, less certain, and we ended up stripping out a lot of that population and having large roving gangs moving through the environments, so that it's much less stable, much less predictable. So we had to, obviously through like cultural acclimatization, the team naturally builds towards Sniper Elite unless we were conscious of doing something else. So we made sure that we changed our population style so that it matched the tone of the location.
What would you say is the most exciting kind of new thing you guys have managed to implement in Atomfall that you're quite proud of?
Well, I've got two answers. One, I like that we've explored a balance between melee and ranged combat that stops you just dropping into that groove of playing the game like a shooter. So changing some mechanics of the game so that you have to be conscious of every fight and decide, do I want to have a fight? So we've got mechanics like if you point a gun at someone, they'll back off. If they've not got a gun, they'll back off because they don't need to get in a fight. But there's a good chance they'll have friends nearby. But you don't know for certain there might be guys nearby because it's all slightly randomized. So that kind of instability and desperation of mixing up different options, I really like that kind of tone. And then the other one is the leads mechanic in the game, which emerged by itself over time. There was an earlier build of the game which was structured more like a Metroidvania game, arguably. So a sequence of sandbox maps that would unlock in a narratively driven order. And over time you would learn skills and tools and things like that that would let you get to the next location in the chain. So like a classic Zelda game as well, I suppose. But we found that felt too guiding for the player, too prescriptive, and it felt a little bit like, given that it was a mystery about what happened in this Atomfall plant, it felt a little bit like everyone else had already had an adventure and you were coming in and picking up the pieces. And that's fine if everywhere is dead and it was hundreds of years ago, but this was 5 years ago and there's still people around talking about it, so it felt a little bit like you were gophering for them, kind of thing. So what we did is hypothetically we said, what happens if you unlock all of the doors in the game? What happens if all of the quests become optional? What happens if nobody tells you what to do? So we had to solve that problem, and structuring that guidance as leads instead of quests was our solution to that. So you never know what's true and what's not true. You're never told, take Father McGinnis's watch to him. You might learn that Father McGinnis wants his watch back, and then it's up to you if you trade that with a barterer, or if you take it back to him, or you blame someone else or whatever. So it seems like a natural progression of quest systems, and led to some really interesting interconnection between all of the elements in the game. And ultimately led to us saying, well, let's let you kill anyone if you want, or side with anyone if you want, and we'll let the player discover what they discover.
detected.